January 7th, 1943, New York City, the 33rd floor of the Hotel New Yorker. A maid named Alice Monahan has been ignoring the sign on the door for 2 days. Do not disturb. She ignores it one final time. The room is cold, curtains drawn. On the windowsill, pigeon feathers. In the bed, still. His name was Nikola Tesla, 86 years old, 140 pounds, the man who designed the electrical system that powers every building on Earth, dead alone in a hotel room, months behind on rent. Most people know the name. Almost no one knows the truth. Before we begin, if stories like this bring you comfort, please subscribe and let me know your country in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you're listening from. Tonight you will learn how Tesla gave away a fortune that would have made him the wealthiest man in the world, and why. How he built a tower meant to deliver free energy to all of humanity, why it was demolished for $1,700 of scrap metal, and why the device in your hand right now carries quietly the fingerprints of his life's work. Take a slow breath. This is the bedtime biography of Nikola Tesla. Chapter 1. The Child Who Lived Twice. The village of Smiljan, in what is now Croatia, sits in a fold of the Dinaric Alps, where the mountains press so close to the valley floor that storms arrive without warning. On the night of July 9th, 1856, one did. Lightning split the sky over the Tesla household as Nikola Tesla labored through the night. The midwife looked at the storm and said this child would be a child of darkness. Nikola looked at the same sky and said, no, he will be a child of light. She was a woman who had never attended a single day of school. She could recite the entirety of the Serbian epic poems from memory. She invented tools for the household, mechanical devices, small and ingenious, built with no instruction, no precedent, nothing but a mind that could see solutions where others saw only problems. Nikola Tesla would later say, with complete conviction, that everything he was came from her, not from his father, the priest, from her. His father, Reverend Milutin Tesla, was educated, respected, literary. He ran daily mental exercises with his children, drills in memory, in reasoning, in recitation. He was a good father by the standards of his time and place. But when Nikola looked inside himself and found the thing that made him different, he always traced it back to his mother's hands, her silent, tireless, unrecognized invention. He was the fourth of 5 children. The eldest boy was named Dane. Dane was extraordinary. Older, brighter, beloved in the way that firstborn sons in Serbian households are beloved, with a particular gravity, a particular hope. He possessed the same photographic memory as Nikola, the same startling capacity for learning. Their parents watched him and saw the future. When Nikola was around 7 years old, Dane died. A horse-riding accident. Some accounts suggest Nikola may have been present. Some suggest he may have inadvertently startled the horse. The documents do not confirm this, and Tesla himself never spoke of it directly. What he did speak of, decades later, was the aftermath. The recollection of his attainments, Tesla wrote, made every effort of mine seem dull in comparison. Anything I did that was creditable merely caused my parents to feel their loss more keenly. He was 7 years old, and already the message had arrived. You are not enough. You are the wrong son. Shortly after Dane's death, Nikola began experiencing visions, not dreams, waking visions. The air around him would fill, unbidden, with tongues of living flame. Objects would pulse with light. He could not control them and could not stop them. They frightened him at first. Then, slowly, he began to understand that the visions were not interruptions of his thinking. They were a form of it. He was a child who had nearly disappeared under his brother's shadow, under his parents' grief. Instead, something else was beginning, something that would one day change the world and quietly break the man who carried it. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Read by Secret Light. Reverend Nikola Tesla believed, with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being right, that reading by candlelight would ruin his son's eyes. He hid the candles each night before bed. He was thorough about it. He was also, in this particular contest of wills, facing the wrong opponent. Nikola made his own candles, from tallow, carefully rendered, shaped in molds he constructed himself. He hid them in his room with the same methodical precision his father used to remove them. When the house went dark and quiet, he lit one and read until dawn. He was 9 years old. What he was reading hardly mattered. What mattered was the compulsion, the absolute inability to stop, the physical discomfort of not knowing, the way his mind moved through information, the way water moves through an open channel. Not by force, but by nature, because there was nowhere else for it to go. He had, by this point, already demonstrated something that unsettled his teachers. He could perform integral calculus in his head, not approximate it, perform it completely, arriving at correct answers through a process he could not always explain and they could not always follow. They suspected cheating. There was no mechanism by which he could have cheated. The answer was simpler and stranger. The calculations were happening visually, as pictures, the numbers arranging themselves in a space only he could see. This was the same gift that produced the visions, the flames, the pulsing light, now disciplined, or at least directed. His mind did not distinguish between imagination and perception the way other minds did. When he thought about a machine, he did not think about it. He saw it, rotating, real, every component present and accounted for. He could find the flaws. He could run it until something wore down, note where the stress accumulated, revise the design, all without touching a single physical object. It was not visualization in the ordinary sense. It was closer to habitation. He lived inside his own constructions. His father wanted him to become a priest. Nikola wanted everything else: physics, engineering, the crackling world of forces and fields that was just beginning, in the 1870s, to reveal itself to science. The argument between them ran for years, patient and circular, the way arguments run in households where both parties love each other and neither will yield. Then Nikola became seriously ill. Cholera, most accounts say, a near-fatal case that lasted months and left him skeletal, hovering. In his own telling, he made his father a bargain from the sickbed. If he survived, he would be allowed to study engineering. His father, frightened enough to concede anything, agreed. Nikola survived. He would later write that during that illness, he discovered the stories of Mark Twain, that they reached him in his weakness and pulled him back, that he read them in the sickbed and found, in their humor and their strange democratic tenderness, something that made him want to continue. He had never met Twain. He was a sick boy in a mountain village, far from everything, but the stories held him. 25 years later, in a laboratory in New York City, the two men would meet. Tesla told Twain the story, how the books had kept him alive. Twain, that great architect of laughter, stood quietly for a moment. Then he wept. Some connections travel a long distance before they close. This one had been traveling since a boy lit a secret candle in the dark and refused, simply refused, to stop. Chapter 3. The Stick in the Sandgras, Austria, 1878, the Imperial Royal Technical College. Professor Jakob Pöschl was a careful man, methodical, respected, the kind of teacher who had spent decades building an understanding of the physical world brick by brick, and who did not appreciate a 22-year-old student suggesting, in the middle of a lecture, that the entire foundation might be rearranged. The demonstration that day involved a Gramme dynamo, a direct current motor, state-of-the-art, the pride of European electrical engineering. It worked by means of commutator brushes, metal contacts that sparked as they transferred current to the rotating armature. The sparking was accepted. It was simply the cost of the thing working at all. Tesla raised his hand and suggested it didn't have to be. What if, he asked, the commutator were eliminated entirely? What if the current itself could be made to rotate, to create a spinning magnetic field that would carry the armature with it, frictionless, sparkless, continuous, no contact, no loss, a motor driven by the invisible geometry of alternating forces? Pöschl stopped the lecture. He turned to face his student, and then, in front of the entire class, he explained with measured patience exactly why this was impossible. Converting a linear force into rotary motion without a commutator, he said, was equivalent to building a perpetual motion machine. It could not be done. It would not be done. Mr. Tesla may accomplish great things, he said, but he certainly never will do this. Tesla sat down. He did not argue further, but something had locked into place behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, and not wounded pride exactly, but something harder than both. A kind of absolute private certainty that would take years to prove and could not be shaken by a single lecture or 100. He carried the problem with him out of Graz, through a gambling addiction that consumed his scholarship and nearly his life, through a period so dark his family believed he had drowned in the Moor River. He carried it through his father's death, which he had not been present for, and through the shame of that absence. He carried it to Budapest in 1881, where he took a position at the Central Telephone Exchange and suffered a breakdown so severe that the sound of a fly landing on a table felt to his hypersensitized nerves like a detonation. At its worst, he could hear a watch ticking from 3 rooms away. A carriage passing miles distant shook his body. The whistle of a locomotive 30 miles off caused him physical pain. He recovered slowly, through long daily walks with his friend Antal Szigeti. The walks became a ritual, miles each day through Budapest City Park, the body moving while the mind, little by little, loosened its grip on its own suffering. Then came the evening of February 1882. They were walking at sunset, Tesla and Szigeti, and Tesla was reciting from memory, as he often did, whole passages, whole cantos, lines from Goethe's Faust. He had reached a particular passage. The light was fading over the park. He spoke the words aloud. The glow retreats, done is the day of toil. It yonder hastes, new fields of life exploring. And the vision arrived. Not gradually, all at once, complete, the way his visions always came, the rotating magnetic field, the armature spinning inside it, the alternating currents precisely out of phase, creating a continuous turning force with no brushes, no sparks, no contact of any kind. The motor Pöschl had said could never exist was rotating, fully formed, in the space in front of him. He grabbed a stick. He knelt in the dirt path of the park. He drew the diagram, the coils, the phases, the geometry of the rotating field, and looked at Szigeti with an expression his friend would later struggle to describe. "Watch me reverse it," Tesla said. And in his mind he did. It would take 6 more years to file the patents. 6 years of working for Edison in Paris and then New York, of digging ditches in lower Manhattan for $2 a day, of building and rebuilding toward a moment that had already happened in a Budapest park at sunset. The invention existed completely in his mind, years before it existed anywhere else. This was both his greatest gift and, though he did not yet know it, the seed of everything that would later go wrong. Because a mind that can see the finished machine before a single component is built, that mind does not always know where vision ends and reality begins. That evening in the park, he could not have known the difference mattered. Chapter 4. 4 Cents and a Letter, New York City, June 1884. He arrived with 4 cents in his pocket, a poem he had written on the crossing, some mathematical computations, and a letter. The letter was from Charles Batchelor, Edison's most trusted European manager, written to introduce this young Serbian engineer who had been working at the Continental Edison Company in Paris. The letter, as later accounts tell it, said something like, "My dear Edison, I know 2 great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." Whether those were the exact words, no original document confirms. The letter does not survive. But Tesla kept the story for the rest of his life, repeating it in interviews and in his autobiography with the particular care a person takes with a memory that carries more weight than it probably should. He was 28 years old. He had crossed an ocean, been robbed somewhere along the route, and nearly witnessed a mutiny aboard the ship. He had arrived in the most electric city on earth, in both senses of the word, wearing a borrowed coat and carrying, in addition to the 4 cents, an absolute and unqualified belief in his own abilities. He walked to Edison's office on Pearl Street and handed over the letter. Thomas Edison read it, looked up, and hired him on the spot. What followed were several months of the most intense work Tesla had ever done, which, given his history of working through the night on homemade candles, was saying something. Edison's DC dynamos were inefficient, unstable, prone to failure. Tesla was tasked with redesigning them. He worked from 10:30 in the morning until 5 the following morning, day after day, 7 days a week, in a building that smelled of machine oil and ambition. He redesigned 24 types of dynamos. He solved problems that Edison's own engineers had declared unsolvable. Edison noticed. He called Tesla one of his hardest workers. He said, in the offhand way he praised people, that there was nothing Tesla couldn't do if he set his mind to it. At the end of this period, Tesla approached his employer about the bonus he believed had been promised, $50,000 for completing the redesigns. Edison's response, delivered with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never expected to be taken literally, has become one of the most repeated lines in the history of invention. "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor." No money was paid. Here the historian must pause, because this story, the $50,000 joke, the cruel dismissal, the moment that crystallized the Edison-Tesla rivalry into a clean, moral fable, exists almost entirely in Tesla's own later accounts and in O'Neill's 1944 biography, written 6 decades after the fact. No contemporaneous document records the offer. No ledger at Edison Machine Works shows a $50,000 commitment. The amount exceeds what the company had readily available. It is possible the offer was made by a manager, not Edison himself. It is possible the figure was exaggerated over years of retelling. It is possible the entire exchange has been polished, in memory, into a shape more satisfying than the truth. What is not in doubt is that Tesla resigned, that he left Edison's employ in the spring of 1885 without the money he felt he was owed, and with a wound that would quietly inform the rest of his life. Not a wound of hatred exactly, but of something more complicated. The knowledge that genius demonstrated clearly and completely was not automatically recognized, that the world required something more than proof. For a man who had staked everything on the supremacy of inner vision, this was a difficult lesson. What followed was the period Tesla's admirers prefer to skip over. He spent months digging ditches for the Edison Electric Light Company, the same company whose systems he had just redesigned, for $2 a day. The foreman knew who he was. The other workers knew who he was. He picked up the shovel each morning and said nothing. He described it later with a kind of flat brevity that suggests the memory was painful enough to warrant compression. My high education in various branches of science, mechanics, and literature seemed to me like a mockery. He was 30 years old. He had the rotating magnetic field complete in his mind, the invention that would eventually power the world. He was digging a trench in Lower Manhattan, and then a small thing happened. A businessman named Benjamin Vail, who had heard something about this Serbian engineer, introduced him to Robert Lane. Lane introduced him to Benjamin Buffington. In 1887, these men provided modest funding for Tesla's own laboratory on Liberty Street. He filed the AC motor patents, 7 of them, in October and November of 1887. In May 1888, he delivered his landmark lecture on the polyphase system to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers. George Westinghouse was in the audience. What Edison had dismissed as incomprehensible, Westinghouse recognized immediately for what it was. Not a theory, not a promise, a complete working system for delivering electrical power to the entire world. He requested a meeting. Tesla accepted. The two men who would change the history of energy sat down together for the first time, and for once in Tesla's life, the man across the table did not need the joke explained. Chapter 5. The Man Who Believed Him. Pittsburgh, 1888. George Westinghouse was not a romantic. He was a manufacturer, a systems thinker, a man who had made his first fortune by inventing the air brake for railway trains, and his second by understanding that the future of industry was not any single device, but the infrastructure connecting all devices together. He did not fund dreams. He funded mechanisms. When he heard Tesla's lecture on the polyphase AC system, he did not hear poetry. He heard architecture. The meeting that followed was brief by the standards of what it accomplished. Westinghouse offered Tesla $200 per AC horsepower in royalties, a consulting salary of $2,000 a month for 1 year, and a lump sum. Accounts vary, but the most widely cited figure is $60,000 in cash and stock for the licensing rights to the AC patents. Tesla, who weeks earlier had been fielding offers from men who wanted to put his name on a company and give him nothing, accepted. He spent a year in Pittsburgh, working inside the Westinghouse machine shops, surrounded by engineers who understood what he had built, but not always how he had built it. Because the how, for Tesla, had happened in a park in Budapest, in a vision, and translating vision into tolerances and manufacturing specifications was a different kind of work entirely. It was sometimes frustrating. Tesla was not a patient collaborator. He was a sovereign mind asked to work in a committee, and the friction showed. But Westinghouse held. Every time his engineers pushed back against Tesla's specifications, every time the practical men said the theoretical design needed adjustment, Westinghouse made the same quiet decision: trust the inventor. This was not naivety. Westinghouse had evaluated the patents with technical rigor before purchasing them. He understood the physics. What he was extending to Tesla was not blind faith, but informed confidence, the rarest thing Tesla had ever been offered, and the thing he had been waiting for since a professor in Graz told him his ideas were impossible. The partnership produced results with remarkable speed. By 1893, Westinghouse and Tesla had underbid General Electric by more than $150,000 to light the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 100,000 incandescent lamps, all running on AC power, illuminating what visitors called the White City. 27 million people attended. For most of them, it was the first time they had seen electric light on such a scale. Then came Niagara Falls. The contract to harness the falls, the most powerful natural energy source in North America, had been contested for years. In 1893, the commission awarded it to Westinghouse, using Tesla's polyphase system. The generators began operation in 1895. On November 16, 1896, AC power reached Buffalo, New York, 26 miles away. Charles Scott, one of the engineers present, called it undoubtedly the most tremendous event in all engineering history. Tesla stood at Niagara and felt something he had not felt since the evening in Budapest. The clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of a vision confirmed. The rotating magnetic field he had drawn with a stick in the sand was now turning turbines the size of houses, sending invisible current across a distance that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. He was 40 years old. He was celebrated, financially comfortable, in the company of a man who had believed in him when the most famous inventor in the world had not. He should perhaps have stopped there. He did not stop there. Chapter 6. The Torn Contract, Pittsburgh, early 1891. The panic of 1890 had arrived the way financial panics always arrive, suddenly and then all at once. Credit tightened across the entire American economy. Companies that had seemed permanent revealed themselves as fragile. George Westinghouse, who had expanded aggressively through the late 1880s on the confidence of a man who had never lost, found himself facing bankers who wanted concessions in exchange for continued support. The concession they wanted most was the Tesla royalty clause. $2.50 per AC horsepower. That was what the contract specified. It had seemed reasonable in 1888, when AC power was a promising theory being tested in machine shops. By 1891, with the Columbian Exposition contract signed and the Niagara Falls bid under serious negotiation, the implications of that royalty clause had become something else entirely. If AC power built out the way Westinghouse believed it would, if it became, as Tesla had always said it would, the architecture of global electrification, then the accumulated royalties would be extraordinary. Hundreds of millions of dollars by some estimates. Perhaps more. Westinghouse came to Tesla personally. He did not send a lawyer or a manager. He came himself, sat down, and explained the situation plainly. The bankers were threatening to withdraw. Without their support, the company could not continue. Without the company, the AC build-out, the whole project, the exposition, Niagara, everything, would stop. He asked Tesla to release the royalty clause. What happened next depends on which account you read and how much of it you choose to believe. John O'Neill, who heard the story directly from Tesla and published it in 1944, describes a dramatic scene. Tesla standing, tearing the contract in two with his own hands, telling Westinghouse that the man who had believed in him when no one else would was worth more than any royalty. Other historians, including W. Bernard Carlson, describe a quieter transaction, a formal legal agreement signed in early 1891 in which Tesla relinquished the per-horsepower clause in exchange for a lump sum payment. The drama may be embellished. The decision was real. What is not disputed is that Tesla gave up what would have been, by any reasonable calculation, one of the largest fortunes in American history. Within a decade, AC power was everywhere. Westinghouse's company grew into one of the most powerful industrial enterprises in the world. Tesla received, in place of his royalties, a one-time payment of $216,000. Significant money, but a fraction of what the clause would have yielded. He never expressed regret, not publicly and apparently not privately. When reporters asked him about it in later years, when he was living in hotel rooms with unpaid bills and feeding pigeons from a park bench, he said only that Westinghouse had been a friend, and that friendship had its own accounting. This tells us something important about Tesla that the popular mythology tends to obscure. He was not, at his core, a man who wanted money. He wanted something money cannot purchase and cannot replace: the specific experience of being understood. Westinghouse had given him that. Edison had withheld it. Morgan would later promise it and then withdraw it. The pattern of Tesla's life, viewed from a certain angle, is less about invention than about that single hunger: to be recognized completely by someone with the power to act on the recognition. Westinghouse had been that person. So when the moment came to choose between the royalties and the relationship, Tesla did not experience it as a sacrifice. He experienced it as a payment of a debt he genuinely felt he owed. Whether this was wisdom or tragedy is a question the evidence refuses to answer cleanly. What the evidence does show is what happened next. With the Westinghouse partnership secured, with Niagara Falls generating and the White City still glowing in the public imagination, Tesla returned to his laboratory in New York and turned his attention to the question that had been forming at the back of his mind since the first time he lit a phosphorescent tube without connecting it to anything. If electricity could be transmitted through a wire, if it could cross 26 miles from Niagara to Buffalo, why did it need the wire at all? Why, in a world full of fields and frequencies and invisible forces moving through the air at the speed of light, did power still require a physical connection between the source and the destination? He had been asking this question quietly for years. Now, with his reputation at its height and his laboratory better equipped than it had ever been, he began to ask it loudly. He began experimenting with high-frequency currents that could light lamps held in a bare hand, no connection required. He demonstrated wireless lighting before audiences who responded with the disoriented delight of people watching something that should not be possible. He gave lectures in London and Paris and New York, each one building toward a claim he had not yet made in full. The claim was this: that the Earth itself could be made to carry electrical power, that a transmitter, properly designed, could turn the entire planet into a conductor. That energy, limitless, universal, free, could flow to anyone, anywhere, who knew how to receive it. He was absolutely certain. He had been absolutely certain before. Chapter 7. The Laboratory Burns, New York City, March 13, 1895. The fire started sometime in the basement. By the time anyone noticed, it had already decided the outcome. The building at 3335 South Fifth Avenue, Tesla's laboratory, his workspace, his home in every sense that mattered, burned through the night while he was elsewhere, and by morning there was nothing left worth saving. 10 years of work gone, the models he had never bothered to patent because he could rebuild them from memory, gone. The photographs, the notes, the carefully constructed apparatus for experiments he had been running toward a conclusion he could almost see, gone. The laboratory journals, the correspondence, the physical record of a decade of the most original electrical research being conducted anywhere in the world. He learned about the fire from a reporter. The accounts of his response vary in their details, but agree on their texture. He was calm, unnervingly calm. He told the reporter that he needed time to think, that he was not yet ready to speak about what had been lost. He returned to his hotel room and stayed there for 3 days, seeing no one, eating almost nothing, sitting in the particular silence of a man who has learned that the external world is even less reliable than he had always suspected. What he was doing in those 3 days was not grieving. Or not only grieving, he was conducting an inventory, running through the contents of his destroyed laboratory the way he ran through everything, visually, completely, room by room and shelf by shelf. He was confirming what he already knew, that the machines existed in his mind as completely as they had ever existed in the physical space on South Fifth Avenue, that the fire had taken the objects, but not the knowledge. He emerged on the 4th day and told a reporter from the New York Herald, "The work is not lost. It is all here." He pointed to his head. What happened next is one of the most quietly significant moments in the entire story, and one of the least told. Thomas Edison sent word that Tesla was welcome to use his laboratory facilities at Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, for as long as he needed. This was the same Thomas Edison who had, 7 years earlier, declined to pay Tesla a promised bonus with a joke about American humor. The same Edison whose direct current system Tesla had helped to defeat. The same man whom popular history would later cast as Tesla's villain, the small-minded establishment figure suppressing the visionary outsider. That man offered his workshop. Tesla does not appear to have accepted the offer, or at least not to have made significant use of it. He was already in conversation with investors about a new laboratory, which he would establish on East Houston Street by the end of the year. But the gesture existed. Edison made it. The narrative of pure enmity, so satisfying and so persistent, does not survive this fact entirely intact. The new laboratory was smaller, less equipped, rebuilt on a foundation of borrowed money and restored determination. Tesla worked through 1895 and into 1896 with a focus that his assistants described as almost frightening. Not the excited energy of a man chasing a new idea, but the concentrated pressure of a man recovering something he had already found and refused to lose again. It was in this rebuilt space that his radio experiments took their most developed form. He constructed equipment for wireless transmission, filed foundational patents, and began preparing for a demonstration he planned to conduct between his Houston Street lab and a receiver at West Point, 50 miles away. He never made that transmission. On July 13, 1895, a young Italian engineer named Guglielmo Marconi filed his first wireless telegraphy patent in Britain. Tesla did not yet know this. He was in his rebuilt laboratory, working by lamplight, reconstructing an apparatus that the fire had taken. The race he did not know he was in had already begun. The rival he had not yet identified was moving quickly, with fewer ideas of his own, but considerably better instincts about what the market would reward. Tesla, meanwhile, was aiming at something Marconi was not aiming at and would never aim at. Not communication, power, not a signal crossing the Atlantic, energy crossing the earth. He was thinking, as he always thought, at the largest possible scale. The fire had taken a laboratory. It had not touched the vision. The vision, if anything, had grown. And somewhere beneath the streets of Lower Manhattan, in a new building with new equipment and the same extraordinary mind at its center, the idea that would become Wardenclyffe was quietly taking its final shape. Chapter 8. The Mountain of Lightning, Colorado Springs, May 18th, 1899. He arrived by train, alone, carrying notebooks and a certainty that had been building for 4 years. The air at 6,000 feet was thin and dry and smelled of pine and distance. Tesla breathed it in and felt, he would later write, that he had found the right place at last, high enough, remote enough, with enough sky above him to attempt something no laboratory in New York City could contain. He had chosen Colorado Springs for reasons that were simultaneously practical and visionary, which was how Tesla made most of his decisions. The altitude meant thinner air, which conducts high-frequency electricity more readily than the denser atmosphere at sea level. The El Paso Electric Company had agreed to provide free alternating current. The land was open, the horizon was wide. And there was, in the scale of the place, the mountains pressing up against a sky that felt closer than it had any right to be, something that matched the scale of what he intended to do. He built a wooden shed on the eastern edge of town. Above the door, he inscribed a line from Dante: "You who enter here leave all hope." Whether this was humor or warning or simple self-dramatization, no one who worked with him thought to ask. Inside the shed, he constructed the largest Tesla coil ever built. The primary coil stretched 51 feet in diameter. The antenna rose 150 feet into the Colorado sky, topped by a copper ball 30 inches across. The working potential reached, by Tesla's own measurements, somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million volts. The sound it produced when operating at full power, a sustained, crackling roar that witnesses compared to continuous thunder, could be heard 15 miles away. The first full-power test, in late June, lasted approximately 10 seconds before the discharge burned out the dynamos at the El Paso Electric Company 6 miles away. Tesla had to personally assist in repairing the equipment before he could continue. The utility, which had offered him free power, had not entirely anticipated what free power would be used for. He continued. Through the summer and into the autumn, he ran experiment after experiment, measuring, adjusting, recording in the Colorado Springs Journal that survives as one of the strangest documents in the history of science, part laboratory notebook, part philosophical meditation, part record of a mind pressing itself against the boundary between what it could demonstrate and what it was convinced must be true. The lightning discharges he produced were real and staggering. Electrical arcs reached outward from the antenna in branching, blinding forks. Sparks appeared spontaneously on horse hooves in neighboring fields. Water pipes buried beneath the ground emitted unexpected blue light. Witnesses reported butterflies circling the antenna, their wings edged with pale fire. Then came the photograph. It appeared in Century magazine the following year, and it became the most famous image ever taken of Tesla, perhaps the most famous image ever taken of any scientist at work. He sits in his laboratory chair, reading calmly, while around him the air erupts in 22-foot electrical arcs, branching and blazing, the room a contained storm. The photograph was a double exposure. Tesla was not in the room when the transmitter was operating. The two images, Tesla sitting quietly and the laboratory in full electrical fury, were combined in the dark room by photographer Dickinson Alley, with Tesla's knowledge and approval, to create a single dramatic composition. The image that became the foundation of Tesla's mythology, the serene genius commanding forces that would destroy an ordinary man, was constructed. It was a portrait of an idea, not a moment. Tesla understood the difference. He approved it anyway. This is worth sitting with, because it is not exactly dishonesty. Tesla was not falsifying a scientific result. He was creating a visual argument, saying, in the language of images, what he believed to be true, that he had mastered these forces, that he was comfortable among them, that the power he was working with was subject to his understanding. The photograph expressed his conviction more accurately than the literal facts, which showed a man who had to leave the room before his own machine could operate safely. The gap between those two things, conviction and fact, vision and demonstration, was the same gap that had always lived at the center of his work. And here, in Colorado, it was beginning to widen. His greatest claimed discovery from the Colorado experiments was what he called stationary waves in the Earth, evidence, he believed, that electrical energy could be transmitted through the planet itself, resonating from one side to the other and back again with almost no loss. He wrote in his journal that he had confirmed the Earth was a conductor of electricity, that a properly tuned transmitter could make the whole globe quiver in resonance, that the dream he had been carrying since his London lectures, free energy, universal, limitless, was not a dream any longer. What he had actually demonstrated was considerably more modest. The near-field resonant experiments were real. The planetary transmission was inference, bold, brilliant inference, built on measurements that his instruments could not fully support. He packed his notebooks and boarded the train back to New York in January 1900. He was more certain than he had ever been, and he was wrong about the most important thing. Chapter 9. The Bargain with Morgan, New York City, 1900. J.P. Morgan was not a man who needed to be impressed. He had financed railroads, restructured steel companies, personally stabilized the American economy during the Panic of 1893 by organizing a private gold reserve when the federal government could not. He occupied a position in American financial life that had no precise equivalent. Part banker, part sovereign, a man whose opinion of a venture was itself a form of capital. Tesla went to him in the autumn of 1900 carrying the Colorado Springs journals and a proposal that had been refined, in his mind, to a condition approaching perfection. The meeting produced a contract signed in March 1901. Morgan would provide $150,000, roughly $5.5 million in today's terms, in exchange for 51% of Tesla's wireless patents and any future patents in the same field. The stated purpose was clear and commercially straightforward: a wireless telegraph station positioned to compete directly with Guglielmo Marconi's growing operation, which was already transmitting signals across the English Channel and preparing for something larger. Tesla accepted the terms. He signed the contract. He took the money. And then he began building something else entirely. Not a telegraph station, a transmitter capable of sending electrical power through the Earth itself, the world system he had been designing in his mind since Colorado Springs, the global network of wireless energy that would make geographical distance irrelevant and deliver limitless power to anyone on the planet who wanted it. The communication component was real, and Tesla intended to deliver it. But it was, in his private conception, almost incidental, a demonstration attached to something vastly larger. He did not tell Morgan this. In July 1901, he wrote to Morgan describing an expanded scope: larger tower, greater power, broader ambitions, framing it as a natural evolution of the original plan rather than a fundamental change of purpose. Morgan, reading the letter, declined to provide additional funding. He had paid for a telegraph station. He did not recall agreeing to fund a planetary energy system. Then came December 12, 1901. Guglielmo Marconi, operating from a cliff-top station in Newfoundland, received 3 faint clicks through a telephone receiver pressed to his ear. The Morse code signal for the letter S transmitted from Cornwall, England, 2,000 miles away. The first wireless transatlantic transmission in history. The news reached Tesla within days. He responded publicly with a composure that did not entirely conceal what was underneath it. "Marconi is a good fellow. Let him continue. He is using 17 of my patents." The comment was characteristic, dry, precise, technically defensible, and also a man watching something he had built being carried away by someone else's hands. Marconi had not stolen the idea. He had simply moved faster, spent less, aimed lower, and arrived first at the destination the market was actually waiting for. Morgan did not call. The investment money that might have flowed to Tesla's wireless vision flowed instead to Marconi's proven system. The window that had briefly opened, the window in which a planetary wireless power network might have attracted sufficient capital to attempt construction, was closing. Tesla wrote longer letters. He made larger promises. He revised his projections upward, his timelines downward, his certainty more absolute with each exchange. Morgan's responses grew shorter. On Long Island, in a town called Shoreham, on 200 acres of flat coastal land purchased from a developer named James Warden, construction had already begun. The tower was rising. Chapter 10. The Tower Rises, Shoreham, Long Island, 1901. The architect was Stanford White, the most celebrated designer in America, the man responsible for the Washington Square Arch, the original Madison Square Garden, the gilded interiors of Gilded Age New York. Tesla had chosen him deliberately. This was not going to be a shed in Colorado with a Dante inscription above the door. This was going to be a statement. The laboratory building rose first. Brick, Italian Renaissance in style, 94 feet square, housing a 200-kilowatt Westinghouse generator and workshop space for Tesla and his small team of assistants. It was, by any measure, a serious industrial facility. Stanford White was satisfied with it. Tesla was already thinking past it. The tower was the thing. 187 feet of wood-framed structure rising from the flat Long Island landscape with the particular authority of something that has no natural business being that tall in that place. At its crown, a hemispherical dome 68 feet in diameter, built from 55 tons of steel, a shape Tesla had calculated with precision, the geometry of a capacitor designed to hold and release electrical charge at the frequencies his system required. Beneath the tower, the ground had been excavated to a depth of 120 feet. 16 iron pipes had been driven 300 feet deeper still. 4 tunnels radiated outward from the base in the cardinal directions. Tesla's description of the purpose was characteristically total. He wanted, he said, to have a grip on the earth so firm that the whole of the globe could quiver. Workers on the site reported strange sensations during early tests, a faint buzzing in metal tools, a tingling in the hands when touching the tower's framework. At night, during the brief electrical experiments Tesla conducted in 1903, witnesses in Shoreham reported flashes of pale light appearing in the sky above the dome, sourceless and silent, lasting only seconds before dissolving back into the dark. They were beautiful by all accounts. They were also the only wireless power Wardenclyffe ever transmitted. The tower reached its full height by the end of 1902. It was, as a physical object, extraordinary, one of the most ambitious structures a private inventor had ever attempted to build, rising from a potato field on Long Island toward a vision that existed completely and perfectly in a single human mind. The problem was not the vision was extraordinary. The problem was the physics, which did not know about the vision and was not going to accommodate it. A century later, on that same flat ground in Shoreham, the laboratory building still stands, restored, protected, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Inside, the original brick walls hold the silence of a place where something enormous was attempted and something real, if smaller than intended, was left behind. The tower is gone. What it pointed toward is everywhere. Chapter 11. The Letter That Was Never Enough. New York City, 1903. The letters began in earnest that summer, July 3rd, 1903. Tesla to Morgan. Will you help me, or let my great work, almost complete, go to pots? July 14th, 1903. Morgan's response, delivered through his secretary, it will be impossible for him to do anything in the matter. Tesla wrote again. Morgan did not respond personally. Tesla wrote again. The secretary replied. Tesla wrote again, longer this time, more detailed, more urgent, the arguments more elaborate, and the promises more specific. The world system fully operational within months, the returns on investment staggering, the historical significance of the moment impossible to overstate. Morgan's office sent a single line. The matter was closed. What is remarkable about these letters, reading them now, is not the desperation, though the desperation is present, carefully dressed in the language of confidence. What is remarkable is the absolute, unbroken certainty. Tesla does not write like a man who suspects he might be wrong. He writes like a man who cannot understand why the evidence of his own conviction is not sufficient proof for everyone else. The tower exists. The system is designed. The physics, as he understands them, are sound. Why is this not enough? He did not, in these letters or anywhere else, acknowledge that he had misrepresented the project to Morgan from the beginning, that the telegraph station Morgan had funded and the planetary power system Tesla was building were not the same thing, had never been the same thing, and that the gap between them was not a matter of scale, but of fundamental purpose. Tesla seems to have genuinely believed that the larger vision justified the smaller deception, that when Morgan saw what was actually being built, gratitude would replace grievance. Morgan never reached the gratitude stage. By 1904, the project had stopped. The generator sat idle. The tower stood complete and untested at full power, its dome catching the Long Island weather, its underground roots gripping a planet that had no idea it was being gripped. Tesla mortgaged the property to George C. Bolt, the proprietor of the Waldorf Astoria, to cover accumulated debts. He continued writing letters to Morgan, to other financiers, to anyone whose name appeared in the social columns as a person of means and possible vision. The responses, when they came, were polite and terminal. In 1905, something broke. Not the tower, the man. Tesla suffered a nervous breakdown, his most severe since Budapest 23 years earlier. The press, which had celebrated him at Niagara and marveled at him in Colorado, now wrote about Wardenclyffe with the particular cruelty of institutions that have decided a story is over. One headline called it Tesla's $1,000,000 folly. Others followed in the same register, the brilliant eccentric, the overreacher, the man who had mistaken his own imagination for a business plan. He read these articles. He collected them, in some cases. He responded to several, in letters to editors that were precise and wounded, and entirely ineffective. Here is what was actually happening beneath the failed fundraising and the newspaper mockery in these years of apparent collapse. The myth of Tesla as suppressed genius was being born. In his own framing of his failure, the visionary blocked by Morgan's greed, the free energy dream extinguished by a man who could not put a meter on it. Tesla was writing the first draft of a story that would outlive him by more than a century and would eventually inspire both serious scientists and deeply unserious conspiracy theorists in roughly equal measure. The story was not entirely false. Morgan did withdraw. The commercial logic of wireless power was genuinely threatening to existing energy infrastructure. These things were real, but the story was not entirely true either. The physics of global wireless power transmission were unsound. The deception of Morgan was real. The certainty that made the letters so remarkable was the same certainty that had made the misrepresentation possible in the first place. Both things were true simultaneously, and the tower stood on Long Island, patient and purposeless, waiting for a resolution that was not coming. Chapter 12, 1750 worth of scrap Shoreham, Long Island, July 4th, 1917. The date was not chosen for symbolism. The Smiley Steel Company had a contract to fulfill and a schedule to keep, and if the date happened to fall on Independence Day, that was a coincidence the men with the dynamite did not pause to consider. They had been hired to bring down a structure. They brought it down. The detonation was heard across the surrounding countryside. The tower, 187 feet of wood and steel and copper, the physical embodiment of the most ambitious private scientific project in American history, collapsed in sections, the dome separating from the frame and hitting the Long Island earth with a concussion that residents of Shoreham felt in their floors and walls. The underground infrastructure, the pipes and tunnels, and the deep grip Tesla had wanted to have on the planet remained in the ground. Too expensive to excavate, too unremarkable to salvage, left to rust slowly in the dark, where no one would think about them again for decades. The scrap was sold, $1,750. That was the number. Not a rumor, not an approximation. The documented transaction price for the physical remains of Wardenclyffe Tower, sold to offset a fraction of the debt Tesla owed to George Bolt, who had foreclosed on the property 2 years earlier when the accumulated mortgage payments finally exhausted his patience. The tower that was meant to transmit free energy to all of humanity was worth at the end slightly less than the annual salary of one of the men who demolished it. Tesla was not present. He was in New York City in a hotel room, and he learned about the demolition the way he had learned about most of the worst events of his life, from someone else after the fact, when there was nothing left to do but absorb it. His response, in the accounts that survive, was almost no response at all. A brief statement, a few words to an assistant, the particular silence of a man who has been preparing for a loss long enough that when it finally arrives, it confirms rather than surprises. What had happened to Wardenclyffe in the 12 years between construction and demolition was not, despite the mythology that grew around it, a story of suppression. It was a story of debt. The foreclosure was initiated not by a government agency, not by a consortium of energy companies protecting their interests, not by Morgan's estate acting on old grievances. It was initiated by a hotel proprietor who was owed money and had waited longer than most creditors would have waited before asking for it back. The war had added a small footnote. In the months before the demolition, the U.S. government had expressed concern that the tower's presence on the Long Island coastline represented a potential navigation or espionage risk. This concern, real, documented, but ultimately secondary, was subsequently inflated in popular accounts into the primary cause of the demolition, the government as villain completing what Morgan had started. The actual cause was simpler and sadder. The bills had not been paid. There is a version of the Wardenclyffe story that Tesla told himself, and that his admirers have been telling ever since, in which a working system was destroyed by forces of greed and institutional fear before it could demonstrate its full potential. In this version, the tower was weeks or months from operational. Morgan's withdrawal was an act of deliberate suppression, and the energy crisis of the 20th century was a consequence of one financier's decision to protect his existing investments. The documented record does not support this version. The tower was never operational at the scale Tesla claimed. The underlying physics of global wireless power transmission through earth conduction were not sound, a conclusion reached not by Tesla's enemies, but by generations of electrical engineers working from first principles and confirmed by the modern understanding of electromagnetic propagation. The Earth ionosphere cavity through which Tesla proposed to transmit energy is a lossy resonator. The efficiency he claimed, 99.5%, is physically impossible. Morgan did not withdraw because he feared the technology. He withdrew because he had been misled about what the technology was, and because a cheaper, proven alternative had made his investment look increasingly poor. None of this makes the loss of Wardenclyffe anything less than it was. It was enormous, not because a working system was destroyed, but because a vision was, and visions, even impossible ones, carry within them the seeds of things that are not impossible at all. The resonant coupling Tesla demonstrated at short range, the near-field wireless transmission that lit lamps in his Houston Street laboratory without wires, was real and sound and ancestral to technology that today sits on nightstands and kitchen counters in 1 billion homes. The idea that energy could move without physical connection was not wrong. The method Tesla chose to scale it to the planet was wrong. $1,750. The men of the Smiley Steel Company loaded the scrap onto trucks and drove away from Shoreham in the late afternoon of July 4th, 1917. The empty lot remained. The laboratory building, Stanford White's Italian Renaissance brick structure, stood alone in the flat Long Island landscape, doors closed, windows darkening. Inside, the silence had the quality of a question no one had thought yet to ask. Chapter 13. The Man in the Vest Pocket, New York City, 1917-1931. The press conferences continued. Every year, on his birthday, July 10th, Tesla invited journalists to whatever hotel room he was currently occupying and told them what he had been working on. The format was consistent. Tesla, impeccably dressed despite the unpaid bills, seated at a table, speaking with the measured authority of a man whose relationship with public attention had never become casual. The journalists came because the statements were always striking, sometimes visionary, occasionally bewildering, and reliably good copy. In 1917, he proposed a system for detecting enemy submarines using electrical resonance, a principle that anticipated radar by 2 decades. The Navy declined to fund it. In 1931, he claimed to have developed a motor powered by cosmic rays, drawing energy directly from the universe itself. No working model was ever demonstrated. In 1934, he announced the death ray, a directed beam of accelerated particles capable of destroying 10,000 aircraft at a distance of 250 miles, which he offered to any nation willing to fund its construction as a weapon of peace. Several governments expressed polite interest. None provided money. The scientific establishment, which had celebrated him at Niagara and quoted his lectures in textbooks, grew quiet. The claims were too large, the demonstrations too absent, the gap between announcement and evidence too wide to sustain credibility in institutions that required one before granting the other. And then, in January 1926, a journalist named John B. Kennedy interviewed Tesla for Collier's magazine. The article, published January 30th, contains the most astonishing paragraph Tesla ever dictated to a reporter. Speaking about the future of wireless communication, he said, "When wireless is perfectly applied, the whole Earth will be converted into a huge brain. We shall be able to communicate with one another instantly, irrespective of distance. Not only this, but through television and telephony, we shall see and hear one another as perfectly as though we were face to face, despite intervening distances of thousands of miles. And the instruments through which we shall be able to do this will be amazingly simple compared with our present telephone. A man will be able to carry one in his vest pocket." He was describing with precision that borders on the uncanny the smartphone, not approximately, specifically, the instant global communication, the video call, the simplicity of the device, the portability. He was 70 years old, living in a hotel on a Westinghouse stipend of $125 a month. And he was describing technology that would not exist for another 80 years, in a form so accurate that reading it today produces a particular quality of vertigo. The establishment that had stopped listening to him was not wrong to stop. The cosmic ray motor was not real. The death ray was not demonstrated. The claims had outrun the evidence in ways that made serious engagement professionally costly. But the man making those claims was also the man who had seen the rotating magnetic field in a Budapest park, who had designed the AC system that Westinghouse built, who had lit the White City and powered Niagara and drawn, with a stick in the sand, the diagram that changed how electricity moves through the world. Both things were true. The same mind, the same vision, the same absolute inability to distinguish between what it could see and what it could prove. In a vest pocket, he had said. The device on which this story is being heard, that device specifically, was in his mind in 1926. He died before he knew he was right. Chapter 14. The Room at the End, Hotel New Yorker, Room 3327, 1933-1943. The room was on the 33rd floor. The number was not accidental. Tesla had requested it specifically. 3,327, a number divisible by 3, on a floor divisible by 3, in a hotel whose address he had calculated before agreeing to take the room. The Westinghouse Electric Company paid the bill quietly, month after month, in the way that institutions sometimes care for the people they have used without wanting the transaction to be visible. He was in his late 70s when he moved in. By the standards of the life he had lived, the Delmonico's dinners, the laboratory on Houston Street, the years of celebrity and invention and catastrophic ambition, the room was small. He had a desk, a bed, a window that looked out over the city, whose electrical infrastructure he had designed. He worked at the desk in the mornings, writing papers that grew increasingly difficult to publish. He slept, by his own account, 3 hours a night. In the afternoons he walked. The routes were fixed and invariable, to Bryant Park, to the steps of the New York Public Library, to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine on 112th Street. Along these routes and at these destinations, he fed pigeons, thousands of them by his own count. He brought seed in his coat pockets, shelled it onto the pavement, and stood among the birds with a patience he had rarely demonstrated toward human beings. He brought injured birds back to the room. He built small splints for broken wings from materials he fashioned himself. The same hands that had designed the magnifying transmitter, constructing tiny supports for the hollow bones of birds that would otherwise die on a sidewalk. He spent over these years more than $2,000 on pigeon care. This at a time when his total monthly income was $125. Among the thousands, there was one, a female pigeon, white with light gray tips on her wings. She came to him differently from the others, not waiting with the flock, but flying directly to him when he arrived, landing on his arm or his shoulder, staying after the others had scattered. Tesla described her, in the account he gave to his biographer John O'Neill, with a directness that still carries its full weight across 80 years. I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me. As long as I had her, there was a purpose to my life. He was 80 years old when he said this. The man who had given away a fortune, outlasted a rival, survived a fire, watched a tower demolished for scrap, predicted the smartphone from a hotel room on $125 a month. That man said the white pigeon gave his life its purpose. This is not madness. It is something more precise than madness and more human. She came to him without requiring proof. She did not need him to demonstrate the system before she would land on his arm. She did not withdraw when the tower fell, or the money ran out, or the press stopped taking him seriously. She came because she came, which is the only reason that had ever been sufficient, and the only reason, in 86 years of a life spent seeking recognition from people with the power to grant or withhold it, that he had never been given. When she was dying, he described a light coming from her eyes, beams of extraordinary intensity, brighter than anything his laboratory had ever produced. He said it with the language of his life's work, because it was the only language he had. After she died, he said, "My life's work is finished." He did not mean Wardenclyffe. He did not mean the AC motor or the radio patents or the Colorado Springs experiments. He meant the thing underneath all of those things. The search that had been running since a 7-year-old boy hid in a mountain chapel after his brother died, and began in the dark to understand that the light he needed would have to come from somewhere inside himself. It had come, at last, from a pigeon's eyes. Chapter 15. The Man from the FBI, January 9th, 1943, 2 days after Tesla died. The Office of Alien Property Custodian received its orders and moved quickly. Agents arrived at the Hotel New Yorker, at storage facilities across Manhattan, at locations where Tesla's belongings had accumulated over decades of hotel living and laboratory work. Approximately 80 trunks were seized. Papers, notebooks, correspondence, equipment, the physical residue of a life spent at the intersection of vision and electricity. The justification was wartime security. Tesla's nephew, Sava Kosanovich, who stood to inherit the estate, had connections to the Yugoslav government, which had connections the FBI found worth scrutinizing. That Tesla himself had been a naturalized American citizen for more than 50 years, that he had lived and worked and paid taxes and fed pigeons in New York City since 1891, did not slow the process. The evaluation was assigned to Dr. John G. Trump, a professor of electrical engineering at MIT, a respected scientist with specific expertise in high-voltage systems. He was thorough, and he was fast. His assessment took 3 days. His conclusion, preserved in documents declassified decades later, was measured and final. Tesla's work from at least the previous 15 years was, in Trump's words, primarily of a speculative, philosophical, and somewhat promotional character. It contained no new, sound, workable principles or methods for realizing the results Tesla had claimed. The death ray, the directed particle beam that Tesla had been announcing at birthday press conferences since 1934, was not present in the papers in any form that constituted a functional design or a dangerous weapon. There was nothing here, Trump concluded, that the government needed to fear. The name bears a moment's consideration. John G. Trump was the uncle of Donald Trump, a connection that history has filed under the category of quietly strange rather than meaningfully significant, but that carries a particular texture when placed against the arc of Tesla's life. The man who had predicted the smartphone, designed global electrification, and died alone in a hotel room, had his life's work evaluated in 72 hours by the uncle of a future American president, who found it harmless. The papers were eventually released to Kosanovich and transported to Belgrade, where they were housed in what became the Nikola Tesla Museum. Approximately 60 trunks arrived. The discrepancy between 80 seized and 60 delivered has never been fully accounted for. A classified project, reportedly designated Project Nick, was established to investigate Tesla's particle beam concept further. Its findings were never published. Its copies of Tesla's papers disappeared into the archive of things the government studied and declined to discuss. Whether those missing trunks contained something significant or simply reflect the mundane disorder of wartime bureaucracy, the documents do not say. What they do say is this: the man who wanted, above everything, to be understood, was evaluated in 3 days, found speculative, and filed. The world moved on. Chapter 16. The Wars Over His Name. The arguments began almost before the funeral flowers had wilted. Serbia claimed him first, or rather reclaimed him, folding Tesla back into a national narrative that needed a genius the way all national narratives need one, as proof that the soil produces exceptional people, that the culture is capable of the extraordinary. His ashes were returned to Belgrade in 1957. The museum built around them became a place of genuine pilgrimage, and also, under Tito's Yugoslavia, a carefully managed symbol, accessible to Soviet delegations, difficult for Western scholars. The archive simultaneously celebrated and controlled. The free energy community claimed him next, and more loudly. The story they assembled from the available facts was not entirely fabricated. Morgan did withdraw, the tower was demolished, the papers were seized, but the connections between those facts were drawn with a confidence the evidence does not support. In this version, Wardenclyffe was operational, the physics were sound, and the suppression was deliberate and total. Tesla became the patron saint of a movement that mixed genuine scientific curiosity with a profound distrust of institutions, and that has produced, in roughly equal measure, independent researchers doing interesting work and people selling perpetual motion devices on the Internet. Silicon Valley claimed him differently. As the archetype of the visionary founder, the man too far ahead of his time for the market to recognize. The genius undone not by the limits of his ideas, but by the limitations of his investors. Elon Musk named a company after him. This version of Tesla is useful and not entirely wrong, but it selects carefully. The AC motor and the Wardenclyffe dream, yes. The eugenics advocacy and the fabricated photographs and the increasingly unverifiable claims, less so. The Internet claimed him most enthusiastically of all, through memes and comics, and the particular democratic fury of people who feel that official history has buried something important. The Oatmeal's 2012 fundraising campaign, which raised more than $1 million to purchase the Wardenclyffe site, was an act of genuine cultural restoration, whatever its understanding of the physics. Each of these claims contains something true. None contains the whole man. The whole man, the one who saw the future in a Budapest park and spent the rest of his life trying to give it to a world that kept asking for receipts, has never been fully claimed by anyone. Perhaps that is exactly right. Chapter 17. What the Charger Knows. The device charging on your nightstand does not know whose idea it is. It charges through induction, through the invisible transfer of energy between two coils of wire, resonating at a shared frequency, no physical contact required. The principle was demonstrated in a laboratory on Houston Street in New York City in the mid-1890s by a man who believed with complete conviction that the same principle could be scaled to the size of a planet. He was right about the principle. He was wrong about the scale. This is the sentence that contains the whole story if you let it. MIT physicists confirmed the near-field resonant coupling in 2007, lighting a 60-watt bulb at 2 meters with 40% efficiency, and citing Tesla explicitly as the ancestor of the work. The Wireless Power Consortium formalized the Qi charging standard in 2008. Today, hundreds of millions of devices charge wirelessly every night, in homes on every continent, drawing on a principle that a Serbian engineer demonstrated before most of those continents had electrical grids. The planetary dream was impossible. The laboratory demonstration was real. The distance between those two things is not a failure. It is the ordinary condition of extraordinary vision, which always sees further than it can reach, and leaves, in the gap between sight and reach, the work that the next generation inherits. Tesla did not solve the energy crisis. He did not transmit power through the earth. He did not build a world without wires. He built the foundation on which other people built those things, imperfectly, incrementally, in ways he would not entirely have recognized or approved. This is how progress actually moves, not in the shape of a single tower rising from a potato field on Long Island, in the shape of 10,000 small lights quietly charging in the dark. Room 3327. January 7th, 1943. The curtains drawn, the pigeon feathers on the sill. A man who arrived in America with 4 cents and a letter spent 60 years trying to give the world something it did not yet know how to receive. He gave it the AC motor and the rotating magnetic field and the seed of every wireless device on Earth. He gave away a fortune because loyalty meant more to him than money. He built a tower that was impossible and magnificent in equal measure and watched it fall for $1,700. He was right about more than the world acknowledged. He was wrong about more than his admirers admit. The same imagination that could not tell the difference between vision and reality. That imagination lit the modern world. It powered Niagara. It charged the device in your hand. It drew, with a stick in the sand at sunset, the diagram that civilization is still building from. The glow retreats, Goethe wrote. Done is the day of toil. Tesla was reciting those words when the vision arrived. He spent the rest of his life trying to share it. Sweet dreams. And we'll meet again soon for another story.